Section 18 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Anne of Cleves, Part 2. A splendid scene it must have been, that gorgeous cavalcade extending from Blackheath through the park to the water's edge, and the broad-bosomed Thames, so gaily dight with the flags and gilded barges of the queen of merchant cities, and all the aquatic pageantry which wealth and loyalty could devise to do honour to the sovereign's bride. But to return to her whose advent had given the citizens of London so proud a holy day, and filled the leafless bowers of Greenwich with unwonted animation at that wintry season of the year. As soon as she and the king had alighted from their horses in the inner court, the king lovingly embraced her, and bade her welcome to her own, then led her by the left arm through the hall, which was furnished below the hearth with the king's guard, and above the hearth with 50 pensioners with their battle axes, and so brought her up to her privy chamber, which Marillac says was richly prepared for her reception. There Henry left her, after which a curious scene took place between him and his unlucky premier, which we cannot do better than relate in the royal despot's own words, as detailed by him a few months afterwards to his council. Upon the day of her entry into Greenwich, after I had brought her to her chamber, he, Cromwell, came with me to mine, and then I said to him, "How say you, my lord? Is it not as I told you? Say what they will, she is nothing fair. Her person is well and seemly, but nothing else." "By my faith you say right," quoth he, "but methinketh she hath a queenly manner withal." "That is right," quoth I, and from that time we had no further communication. But the ruin of Cromwell may be dated from that hour. He told the king, "He was sorry his grace was no better content," on which Henry bade him call the council together, in the hope of finding a remedy, even after he had committed himself by this public reception of the lady. The council met that very afternoon. Oslinger and Hosteden, when summoned, appeared much astonished at the mention of the pre-contract between Anne and the Marquis of Lorraine. They answered, Cromwell says, like men perplexed, and deferred their definite replies till the next morning. Meantime the crowd of spectators and the inferior actors in the state pageant dispersed, for which Hall tells us the signal was given by the mighty peal of guns that was shot from Greenwich Tower, when the king and queen entered the court together. Then all the horsemen broke their ranks, and had leave to depart to London or to their lodgings. To see how long it was or ever the horsemen could pass, and how late it was ere the footmen could get over London Bridge, pursued he, I assure you it was wondrous to behold. At this juncture the Lord Chamberlain inquired of the king, what day his majesty would be pleased to name for the coronation of the queen? "We will talk of that when I have made her my queen," was the ominous reply of the moody monarch. The next morning, Sunday, Cromwell came by the private way to Henry's private chamber, and informed him that the ambassadors of Cleves treated the idea of the pre-contract with contempt, and had offered to remain in prison as pledges for the arrival of the revocation of the sponsalia. Henry was much annoyed at this intelligence, and exclaimed, "I am not well handled," adding, "If it were not that she is come so far into my realm, and the great preparations that my states and people have made for her, and for fear of making a ruffle in the world, and of driving her brother into the hands of the emperor and the French king, who are now together, I would not marry her now." After dinner on the same Sunday, Henry sent for all his council, and repeated his favourite expression, that he was not well handled about the contract with the Prince of Lorraine, and required that Anne should make a solemn protestation that she was freed from all pre-contracts. This she did in the presence of all Henry's council and notaries. When Cromwell informed Henry that it had been done, he repeated, "Is there then none other remedy but I must needs against my will put my neck into the yoke?" On which Cromwell withdrew, leaving his lord in what he politely terms a study or pensiveness. In other words, an access of sullen ill humour, in which Henry remained till the Monday morning, when he declared that it was his intention to go through with it, and directed that the nuptials should be solemnized on the following day, January 6th, being the Epiphany or Feast of Kings, commonly called Twelfth Day, and set about preparing himself for the ceremonial. Short notice this for the bride, but her feelings had been outraged in every possible way. Next came the question, who should lead her to the altar? Two noblemen of her own court, the Earl of Overstein and the Grand Master Hostodin, who had come to England with her expressly for that purpose, and to superintend all the arrangements of her marriage. Henry chose to associate the Earl of Essex with the Earl of Overstein in the honour of leading her. Then, as if to render everything as inconvenient as possible to the princess, he fixed the early hour of 8 in the morning for the solemnity. The Earl of Essex was not punctual to the time, on which Henry deputed Cromwell to take the office of conducting the bride, and sent him to her chamber for that purpose. But before Anne was ready, Essex arrived, and Cromwell returned to Henry's privy chamber to inform him. Henry was by that time arrayed in his wedding dress, which is thus described by Hall. His grace was apparelled in a gown of cloth of gold, raised with great flowers of silver, and furred with black genettes. His coat, crimson satin, slashed and embroidered, and clasped with great diamonds, and a rich collar about his neck. In this array he came into his chamber of presence, and calling Cromwell to him, said, "My lord, if it were not to satisfy the world and my realm, I would not do what I must do this day for any earthly thing." Then one of the officers of the household informed him the queen was ready, on which he, with his lords and officers of state, advanced into the gallery next the closets, and there paused, and, with some expressions of displeasure that she was so long in coming, sent the lords to fetch the queen. Who can blame Anne for her tardiness on this occasion after all Henry's insulting demurs and discourtesies? She had, however, consoled herself by making a very elaborate and splendid toilet. She was dressed in a gown of rich cloth of gold, embroidered very thickly, with great flowers of large oriental pearls. It was made round and without a train, after the Dutch fashion, which, it appears, was not admired in England. She wore her luxuriant yellow hair flowing down her shoulders, and on her head a coronal of gold, full of costly gems, and set about with sprigs of rosemary, an herb of grace, which was used by maidens both at weddings and funerals. About her neck and waist she wore jewels of great price. Thus arrayed, the royal bride came forth from her closet between the Earl of Overstein and the Earl of Essex, according to Hall, with most demure countenance and sad composed behaviour, passed through the king's chamber. The lords went before her in procession, and when they reached the gallery where the king was, she made 3 low obeisances and curtsies. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer, received them and married them together. The Earl of Overstein gave her away, and about her wedding ring was inscribed, "God send me weal to keep." A more appropriate motto could scarcely have been chosen for a wife of Henry VIII. No doubt the poor queen had that prayer very often on her lips. After the marriage was celebrated, they went hand in hand into the king's closet, and there heard mass and offered their tapers. After mass they took wine and spices, which done, the king departed to his chamber, and all the ladies attended the queen to her chamber, the Duke of Norfolk walking on her right hand, the Duke of Suffolk on her left. After 9 of the clock, the king, in a gown of rich tissue, lined with crimson velvet, embroidered, came to his closet, and she, in the same dress in which she was married, came to her closet, with her sergeant of arms, and all her officers before her, like a queen. And the king and she went openly in procession, and offered and dined together. After dinner, the queen changed into a dress, made like a man's gown, of tissue, with long sleeves, girt about her, and furred with rich sables. Her narrow sleeves were very costly. On her head she wore such a cap as on the preceding Saturday, with a coronet of lawn, which cap was so rich of pearls and gems, that it was judged to be of great value. Her ladies and gentlewomen were apparelled very richly, after her fashion, which, from Marillac's report, we have seen was not the most becoming in the world. They were all decorated with rich chains. In the dress just described, our Lutheran queen Anne accompanied her lord to evensong, as she had in the morning to mass, and afterwards supped with him. After dinner were banquets, masques, and divers disports, till the time came that it pleased the king and her to take their rest. The Sunday after, solemn jousts were kept in honour of the royal nuptials, which much pleased the foreigners. On that day, continues Hall, the queen was apparelled after the English fashion, with a French hood, which so set forth her beauty and good visage, that every creature rejoiced to behold her. Not a word does the courtier-like chronicler relate of the king's ill humour, or of his contempt for his new queen. Another contemporary historian, who is evidently an admirer of Anne, quaintly observes, "Well, it pleased his highness to dislike her, but to me she always appeared a brave lady." The reports of her contemporaries vary so greatly as to the personal characteristics of this queen, that an exact description of her appearance, from the original pencil sketch among the Holbein heads, in her majesty's collection at Windsor, may not be uninteresting to the reader. The sketch was probably taken after her arrival in England, and, though unfinished, is a very fine specimen of art. There is a moral and intellectual beauty in the expression of the face, though the nose and mouth are large and somewhat coarse in their formation. Her forehead is lofty, expansive, and serene, indicative of candour and talent. The eyes large, dark, and reflective. They are thickly fringed, both on their upper and lower lids, with long black lashes. Her eyebrows are black and finely marked. Her hair, which is also black, is parted, and plainly folded on either side of the face in bands, extending, as in the present fashion, below the ears, a fashion that seems peculiarly suitable to the calm and dignified composure of her countenance. Nothing, however, can be more unbecoming than her dress, which is a close-fitting gown, with a stiff high collar, like a man's coat, and tight sleeves. The bodice opens a little in front, and displays a chemisette, drawn up to the throat with a narrow riband, and ornamented on one side with a brooch in the form of a Catharine wheel, placed very high. She wears a large Amazonian-looking hat, turned boldly up in front, not in the Spanish but the Dutch fashion, decorated with quarter files of gems. Such a head-dress would have been trying even to a soft and feminine style of beauty, but the effect on the large, decided features of this queen is very unfortunate. Anne of Cleves appears to have had the most splendid wardrobe of all Henry's queens, but the worst taste in dress. When the Earl of Overstein and the other nobles and ladies who had attended Anne to England had been honourably feasted and entertained by Henry and his magnates, they received handsome presents, both in money and plate, and returned to their own country. The Earl of Waldeck and some other gentlemen and ladies, with the Dutch maids of honour, remained with her till she became better acquainted with the English people and language. On the 4th of February, Anne was conducted, by the king and his ministers, by water to the palace of Westminster, which had been magnificently prepared for her reception. The king and queen were attended on their voyage up the Thames by many peers and prelates in state barges, gaily emblazoned and adorned. The mayor and aldermen of London, in their scarlet robes, gave attendance. Also, with 12 of the principal city companies, in barges, garnished with pennons, banners, and targets, with rich awnings, and bands of music within, which, according to the chronicler, was being replenished with minstrelsy. All the way up the river the ships saluted the royal barge as it passed, and a mighty peal was fired from the great Tower guns, in goodly order, to greet and welcome the sovereign and his bride. Henry VIII's whim of entwining his initials with those of a new wife is apparent even during the ephemeral queenship of Anne of Cleves. Several medallions are still remaining in the ceiling of the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, with the letters H.A. garnished with the true love knots which Anne Boleyn had found so false and evanescent when he invented that device to testify his devotion to her. The date 1540, within these medallions, identifies them as having been enamelled during the brief reign of Anne of Cleves. Similar medallions, with the same initials, appear in the tapestried chamber at St. James's, in the carving over the chimney piece. There was an appearance of outward attention to Anne on the part of the king, but her ignorance of the English language, of music, and of her want of that delicate tact which constitutes the real art of pleasing, prevented her from gaining on his affections. Henry had been used to the society of women of superior intellect and polished manners. Such had been Catherine of Aragon, such Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour, if she lacked the mental dignity of the first, or the genius and wit of the second, made up for both in the insinuating softness, which was, no doubt, the true secret of her influence over Henry's mind. Anne was no adept in the art of flattery, and, though really of meek and gentle condition, she did not humiliate herself meanly to the man from whom she had received so many unprovoked marks of contempt. Henry complained to Cromwell that she waxed wilfully and stubborn with him. Anne, who had doubtless been aggravated in every possible way, sent often to Cromwell requesting a conference with him, but in vain. Cromwell knew he was in a perilous predicament, surrounded by spies and enemies, and, like the trembling vizier of some eastern tyrant, who sees the fatal bowstring ready to be fitted to his neck, deemed that one false step would be his ruin, he positively refused to see the queen. While Anne was thus tormented and perplexed by the persecutions of her unreasonable husband, terror was stricken into every heart by the execution of two of his nearest kinsmen, whom he relentlessly sent to the block on the 3rd of March. One was the favourite companion of his youth, Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, the son of his aunt Catharine Plantagenet. The other was Henry Pole, Lord Montague, the son of Margaret Plantagenet, Countess of Salisbury. The offence for which they suffered was correspondence with Reginald Pole, afterwards the celebrated cardinal, whom Henry called his enemy. Anne's dower was settled according to the usual forms when Parliament met, April 12th. It seems remarkable that Henry, who from the first had declared that he could not overcome his aversion to her sufficiently to consider her as his wife, should have permitted this legislative recognition of her rights as queen consort of England. On the 1st of May, and 3 succeeding days, a company of the knightly gallants of the court, among whom Sir Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane, Sir John Dudley, and Sir George Carew, were the most distinguished, held joust, tourney, and barrier, at Durham House, all dressed in white velvet, in honour of the king's recent marriage with Anne of Cleves. The king and queen honoured the pageant with their presence, and were honourably feasted and entertained by their bachelor hosts. This was the last time the king and queen appeared in public together. Wriothesley, the most unprincipled of the low-born parasites who rose to greatness by truckling to the lawless passions of the sovereign, prepared the way for the divorce by lamenting to the gentlemen of the privy chamber and the council the hard case in which the king's highness stood in being bound to a wife whom he could not love, and he went on to suggest the expediency of emancipating the king from a wedlock that was so little to his taste. A gentleman of honour and feeling would rather have regarded the case of the injured and insulted princess with compassion, but Wriothesley was devoid of every generous sympathy, and his conduct towards females in distress was always peculiarly cruel, as we shall have occasion to show in the memoirs of Catherine Howard and Catharine Parr. With ready instruments of wickedness ever at hand like Wriothesley, we almost cease to wonder at the atrocities that were perpetrated by Henry VIII. When the idea of a divorce had been once suggested to the king, the situation of his luckless queen was rendered insupportable to her, and Henry, in addition to all his other causes of dissatisfaction, now began to express scruples of conscience on the score of keeping a Lutheran for his wife. Anne, who had been unremitting in her endeavours to conform herself to his wishes by studying the English language and all things that were likely to please him, became weary of the attempt, and was at length piqued into telling him that, if she had not been compelled to marry him, she might have fulfilled her engagement with another to whom she had promised her hand. It is just possible that, under the provocations she had endured, she might add, a younger and more amiable prince, whom she would have preferred had she been left to her own choice. Henry only waited for this, for though he had lived with Anne between 4 and 5 months, he had never, as he shamelessly acknowledged, intended to retain her permanently as his wife, especially as there was no prospect of her bringing him a family. It was the peculiar wickedness of Henry that he always added outrage to faithlessness, when he designed to rid himself of a lawful wife. In the present instance, not contented with disparaging the person and manners of the ill-treated princess of Cleves, he basely impugned her honour, as if she had not been a virtuous woman when he received her hand. Every one about him was aware of his motives in uttering these slanders, which were designed to terrify the queen into consenting to a dissolution of her marriage. Her situation was rendered more wretched by the dismissal of her foreign attendants, whose places were supplied by English ladies appointed by the king. That the sage superintendent of the Flemish maids of honour was regarded as the channel through which all preferments and places in the queen's court were to flow, may be seen from a contemporary letter written by Catherine Basset to her mother, the wife of the king's illegitimate uncle, Arthur Plantagenet, Viscount Lisle. The letter is transcribed as a whole, as affording a curious evidence of the language, customs, and straitened means of some of the young ladies connected with the court of Henry VIII. Madam, in my humble wise, my duty done to your ladyship, certifying your ladyship that my lord of Rutland and my lady be in good health, and hath them heartily commend to your ladyship, thanking you for your wine and your herring that you sent them. Madam, my lady hath given me a gown of Kaffa damask of her own old wearing, and that she would in no wise that I should refuse it, and I have spoken to Mr. Hughes for a roll of buckram to new line it, and velvet to edge it withal. Madam, I humbly beseech your ladyship to be good lady and mother to me, for my lady of Rutland said that Mother Lowe, the mother of the Dutch maids, may do much for my preferment with the queen's highness, so that your ladyship would send her my good token, that she may the better remember me, trusting that your ladyship would be good lady to me in this behalf. Madam, I have received of Ravenford 2 crowns, for which I humbly thank your ladyship. I do lack a kettle, suppose kirtle, for every day. I beseech your ladyship that I may have it. And I desire your ladyship that I may be humbly recommended to my lord and to my sisters. Madam, my brother George is in good health, and in the court with Sir Francis Bryan. And thus the Holy Ghost have you in his keeping, who send your ladyship good life and length to his pleasure. Written at York Place, the 17th day of February, by your humble daughter, Catherine Basset. To the right honourable and my very good lady and mother, my lady Lisle, be this delivered at Calais. Our readers will, perhaps, be glad to learn this humble young lady of rank, to whom the present of a cast-off gown and 2 crowns was so extremely acceptable, succeeded in obtaining the appointment of maid of honour to Queen Anne. When the strange maidens, as the Flemish maids of honour were called, were about to depart, and the queen's chamberlain applied to Cromwell for their safe conduct, the cautious minister, who had carefully kept aloof from the slightest communication with Anne or her household, availed himself of this opportunity of sending a secret warning to his royal mistress of the expediency of doing her utmost to render herself more agreeable to the king. Anne acted upon the hint, but without any sort of judgment, for she altered her cold and reserved deportment into an appearance of fondness, which, being altogether inconsistent with her feelings, was anything but attractive. Henry, knowing that it was impossible she could entertain affection for him, attributed the change in her manner to the representations of Cromwell, to whom he had confided his intentions of obtaining a divorce, and this suspicion aggravated the hatred he had conceived against him for having been the means of drawing him into the marriage. Besides this, Henry had recently become deeply enamoured of the young and beautiful Catherine Howard, niece to the Duke of Norfolk, and passionately desired to make her his wife. The leaders of the Catholic party were eager to secure the twofold triumphs of obtaining a queen of their own way of thinking, and effecting the downfall of their great enemy, Cromwell. There is every reason to believe that the death of his unpopular favourite was decreed by Henry himself at the very time when, to mask his deadly purpose, he bestowed upon him the honours and estates of his deceased kinsman, Bourchier, Earl of Essex. The fact was, he had a business to accomplish, for which he required a tool, who would not be deterred by the nice feelings of a gentleman of honour from working his will. This was the attainder of 2 ladies allied, one by blood, the other by marriage, to the royal line of Plantagenet. Gertrude, Marchioness of Exeter, the widow of one of his kindred victims, and Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, the mother of the other. Cromwell produced in the House of Lords, May 10th, by way of evidence against the countess, a vestment of white silk, that had been found in her wardrobe, embroidered in front with the arms of England, surrounded with a wreath of pansies and marigolds, and on the back the representation of the host, with the 5 wounds of our Lord, and the name of Jesus written in the midst. Cromwell persuaded the lords that this was a treasonable ensign, and as the countess had corresponded with her absent son, she was for no other crime attainted of high treason, and condemned to death without the privilege of being heard in her own defence. The Marchioness of Exeter was also attainted and condemned to death by the same illegal process, in direct opposition to the laws of England. Both ladies were, meantime, confined in the Tower. The lords indeed hesitated, for the case was without precedent, but Cromwell sent for the judges to his own house, and asked them, whether the Parliament had a power to condemn persons accused without a hearing. The judges replied, that it was a nice and dangerous question, for law and equity required that no one should be condemned unheard, but the Parliament being the highest court of the realm, its decision could not be disputed. When Cromwell, by reporting this answer in the House, satisfied the peers that they had the power of committing a great iniquity if they chose to do so, they obliged the king by passing the bill, which established a precedent for all the other murders that were perpetrated in this reign of terror. As an awful instance of retributive justice be it recorded that Cromwell was himself the first person who was slain by the tremendous weapons of despotism, with which, like a traitor to his own country, he had furnished the most merciless tyrant that ever wore the English crown. Exactly 1 month after this villainy, Cromwell was arrested by the Duke of Norfolk at the council board, and sent to the Tower, by the command of the king, who, like a master fiend, had waited till his slave had filled up the full measure of his guilt before he executed his vengeance upon him. Another victim, but a blameless one, was also selected by Henry to pay the penalty of his life for having been instrumental in his marriage with Anne of Cleves. This was the pious and learned Dr. Barnes, whom the queen had greatly patronized, but was unable to preserve from the stake. Her own reign was drawing to a close. A few days after Cromwell's arrest, she was sent to Richmond, under the pretence that her health required change of air. Marillac, in a letter to Francis I, thus alludes to the reports to which this circumstance had given rise. June 23rd. There is a talk of some diminution of love and a new affection for another lady. The queen has been sent to Richmond. This I know, that the king, who promised in 2 days to follow her, has not done so, and does not seem likely to do so, for the road of his progress does not lead that way. Now it is said in the court that the said lady has left on account of the plague, which is in this city, which is not true. For if there had been any suspicion of the kind, the king would not have remained on any business, however important, for he is the most timid person in the world in such cases. The removal of Anne was the preliminary step to the divorce, for which Henry was now impatient. The particulars of this transaction, as they appeared on the journals of the House of Lords, show, in a striking manner, the artfulness and injustice of the king, and the slavishness of his ministers and subjects. On Tuesday, the 6th of July, the Chancellor, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, the Earl of Southampton, and the Bishop of Durham, stated to the House that they, having doubts of the validity of the marriage between the king and queen, to which they had been instrumental, and as the succession to the crown was, or might be effected, it was highly necessary that its legality should be investigated by a convocation of the clergy. A petition that the king would permit this to be done was then got up and presented to the sovereign by both houses of Parliament. Henry was graciously pleased to reply, that he could refuse nothing to the estates of the realm, and was ready to answer any questions that might be put to him, for he had no other object in view but the glory of God, the welfare of the realm, and the triumph of truth. The matter was brought before the convocation on the following day, and the clergy referred it to a committee, consisting of 2 archbishops, of 4 bishops, and 8 divines. The reasons alleged for releasing the sovereign from his matrimonial bonds with his queen were as follows. First, that she was precontracted with the Prince of Lorraine. Secondly, that the king, having espoused her against his will, had not given an inward consent to his marriage, which he had never completed, and that the whole nation had a great interest in the king's having more issue, which they saw he could never have by this queen. Many witnesses were examined, as the lords in waiting, gentlemen of the king's chamber, and the queen's ladies. From the depositions of the Countess of Rutland, Lady Edgecombe, and the infamous Lady Rochford, we learn that the king's morning salutation to Anne when he left her apartment was, "Farewell, darling," and at night he was wont to say, "Good night, sweetheart." This they affirmed the queen had told them. They had presumed to ask many impertinent questions of their royal mistress, and among others, if she had acquainted Mother Lowe, her confidential attendant and countrywoman, of the king's neglect. Anne replied, that she had not, and added, that she received quite as much of his majesty's attention as she wished. Henry had encouraged the ladies of the bedchamber to mimic and ridicule his unfortunate consort for his amusement, but never did any lady conduct herself with greater prudence and dignity than this ill-treated princess. Henry, on the contrary, degraded the dignity of the crown, and rendered himself the laughing-stock of all Europe, by his unprincely follies on this occasion. The following statement is a portion of what he terms his brief, true, and perfect declaration. "I had heard," says he, "much, both of her excellent beauty and virtuous conditions, but when I saw her at Rochester, it rejoiced my heart that I had kept me free from making any pact or bond with her, till I saw her myself, for then, I assure you, I liked her so ill, and so far contrary to that she was praised, that I was woe that ever she came to England, and deliberated with myself, that if it were possible to find means to break off, I would never enter yoke with her. Of which misliking the Flemish great master, Hosteden, the admiral, that now is Southampton, and the master of the horse, can and will here record. Then, after my repair to Greenwich the next day after, I think, and doubt not, that the Lord Essex, Cromwell, well examined, can and will, and hath declared, what I then said to him in that case. For as he is a person which knoweth himself condemned by act of parliament, he will not damn his soul, but truly declare the truth, not only at the time spoken by me, but also continually till the day of the marriage, and also many times after, whereby my lack of consent, I doubt not, doth or shall well appear." The document from which this abstract is taken is called, by Burnet, an original, and it is certainly in coarseness of expression without parallel, and affords a characteristic specimen of the brutality of Henry's manners and language. The convocation of the clergy, without one dissident voice, pronounced the marriage to be null and void, June 9th, and that both parties were free to marry again. The next day, Archbishop Cranmer reported to the House of Lords this sentence, in Latin and English, and delivered the documents attesting it, which were sent to the Commons. A bill to invalidate the marriage was twice read, and passed unanimously, July 13th, being only the 8th day from the commencement of the whole business. Cranmer, who had pronounced the nuptial benediction, had the mortifying office of dissolving the marriage. Anne of Cleves, being the third queen from whom it had been his hard lot to divorce the king in less than 7 years. Well might Chatillon, the French ambassador, whom Marillac succeeded, say of Henry, "He is a marvellous man, and has marvellous people about him." The queen, being a stranger to the English laws and customs, was spared the trouble of appearing before the convocation, either personally or by her advocates. When all things had been definitely arranged, according to the king's pleasure, Suffolk, Southampton, and Wriothesley were appointed by him to proceed to Richmond and signify his determination to the queen and to obtain her acquiescence. So powerfully were the feminine terrors of the poor queen excited on this occasion that she fainted and fell to the ground before the commissioners could explain the true purport of their errand. When she was sufficiently recovered to attend to them, They soothed her with flattering professions of the king's gracious attentions of adopting her for a sister, if she would resign the title of queen, promising that she should have precedence before every lady in the court, except the king's daughters and his future consort, and that she should be endowed with estates to the value of £3,000 a year. Anne was greatly relieved when she understood the real nature of the king's intention, and she expressed her willingness to resign her joyless honours with an alacrity for which he was not prepared. The enduring constancy of the injured Catharine of Aragon, the only woman who ever loved him, had taught Henry to regard himself as a person so supremely precious that he certainly did not expect Anne of Cleves to give him up without a struggle. Even when she, in compliance with the advice of the commissioners, wrote, or rather, we should say, subscribed a most obliging letter to him, expressing her full acquiescence in his pleasure, he could not believe she really meant thus lightly to part from him. Henry next wrote to his council, at the head of whom was his brother-in-law, the Duke of Suffolk, desiring them to consider whether they should further press the Lady Anne to write to her brother or no. However, before he concludes this letter, he determines that point himself. We have resolved that it is requisite ye should now, before your departure, procure both the writing of such a letter to her brother, and also the letter before written to us in English, subscribed with her hand, to be by her written in Dutch, to the intent that all things might more clearly appear to him. And concerning these letters to her brother, how well soever she speaketh now, with promises to abandon the condition or caprices of a woman, and evermore to remain constant in her proceedings, we think good, nevertheless, rather by good ways and means to prevent, that she should not play the woman, though she would, than to depend upon her promise. Nor after she hath felt, at our hand, all gratuity and kindness, and known our liberality towards her in what she requireth, to leave her at liberty, upon the receipt of her brother's letters, to gather more stomach and stubbornness than were expedient. So that if her brother, upon desperation of us, should write to her in such wise, as she might fondly take to heart, and fancy to swerve from her conformity, all our gentle handling of her should, in such a case, be frustrate, and only serve her for the maintenance of such conceit as she might take in that behalf, and that she should not play the woman though she would. Therefore our pleasure is, that ye travail with her to write a letter to her brother directly, with other sentences, agreeable to the minutes which we send you herewith, as near as ye can. For persuading her thereto, ye may say, that considering she hath so honourably and virtuously proceeded hitherto, whereby she hath procured herself much love, favour, and reputation, it shall be well done, if she advertises her brother of all things, as he may demean himself wisely, temperately, and moderately in the affair, not giving ear to tales and bruits, or reports. Unless these letters be obtained, all shall remain uncertain upon a lady's promise, namely, that she will be no woman, the accomplishment whereof, on her behalf, is as difficult in the refrainment of a woman's will, upon occasion, as in changing her womanish nature, which is impossible. And thus did this tyrannical self-deceiver, while in the very act of manifesting the most absurd caprice that any despot could perpetrate, reflect on the constancy of the female sex, the most wayward and weak of whom could scarcely vie with him in fickleness and folly. Ye may say to her, he concludes, for her comfort, that howsoever her brother may conduct himself, or her other friends, she, continuing in her uniformity, shall never fare the worse for their faults. Given under our signet at the Palace of Westminster, the 13th of July, the 32nd year of our reign. In 3 days, Anne, or her advisers, addressed the following letter to Henry. Most excellent and noble prince, and my most benign and good brother, I do most humbly thank you for your great goodness, favour, and liberality, which, as well by your majesty's own letters, as by the report and declaration of your councillors, the Lord Great Master, the Lord Privy Seal, and your grace's secretary, I perceive it hath pleased you to determine towards me. Whereunto I have no more to answer, but that I shall ever remain your majesty's most humble sister and servant." The Duke of Suffolk, Henry's ready tool in all his matrimonial tyrannies, Lord Southampton, and Sir Thomas Wriothesley, the king's secretary, went to the queen at Richmond, and, in their narrative of their proceedings with her, take great credit for having animated her to subscribe herself the king's sister. They brought a token from the king, which consisted of 500 marks in gold, being an instalment in advance of her pension, which she received both humbly and thankfully; and having read the king's letters, returned to him her marriage ring as a token of her sincerity, with a letter written in German, the tenor of which the councillors sent translated to the king. On the 17th of July, these persons, by the order of Henry, came to Richmond to discharge such officers of her household as had been sworn to attend her as queen, and to appoint such others as were assigned to wait on her, and serve her, as domestics, as the king's adopted sister. At which time she both took her leave of such as departed, and welcomed very gently her new servants, at that time by the said duke, earl, and Sir Thomas, presented to her. She declared withal of herself how much she was bound to the king's majesty, and how determined she was to submit herself wholly to repose in his goodness, according to her writing made to his highness, saying, she would be found no woman by inconstancy and mutability, though all the world should move her to the contrary, neither for her mother, her brother, or none other person living; adding, that she would rather receive no letters nor message from her brother, her mother, nor none of her kindred and friends, but she would send them to the king's majesty, and be guided by his determination. After this, they again attended her, to present unto her certain things of great value and richness, which his majesty then gave to her, and also to show to her certain letters, which his majesty had received from the duke her brother, and also from the bishop of Bath, ambassador from England, then resident at the court of the Duke of Cleves. Which letters, being opened and read, she gave most humble thanks to the king's majesty that it pleased him to communicate the same to her. And as, from a part of the English ambassador's letter, there appeared as if doubts had arisen in the minds of the Duke of Cleves and Oslinger his minister, as to whether the Lady Anne were well treated, she wrote a letter to her brother in her own language, and a nephew of Oslinger's, then in King Henry's service, called in, and told him, before the said duke, earl, and Sir Thomas, to make her hearty commendations to her brother, and to signify to him that she was merry, or cheerful, and honourably treated, and had written her full and whole mind to him in all things. And this, continues the document, she did with such alacrity, pleasant gesture, and countenance, as he, young Oslinger, which saw it, may well testify that he found her not miscontented. To the care of this Flemish youth was deputed the conveyance of Anne's letter to her brother, from which the following are extracts. My dear and well-beloved brother, after my most hearty commendation, whereas by your letters of the 13th of this month, which I have seen, written to the king's majesty of England, my most dear and most kind brother, I do perceive you take the matter, lately moved and determined between him and me, somewhat to heart. Forasmuch as I had rather ye knew the truth by mine advertisement, than for want thereof ye should be deceived by vain reports, I thought meet to write these present letters to you, by which it shall please you to understand how the nobles and commons of this realm desired the king's highness to commit the examination of the matter of marriage between his majesty and me to the determination of the holy clergy of this realm. I did then willingly consent thereto, and since their determination made, have also, upon the intimation of their proceedings, allowed, approved, and agreed to the same. She then proceeds to say that she was provided for and adopted as the king's sister, and that she wishes her good mother to know the same. She likewise desires that no interruption may take place in the political alliance between England and her native country, and concludes, God willing, I purpose to lead my life in this realm. Anna, Duchess born of Cleves, Gulick, Geldre, and Berge, and your loving sister. The only danger to Anne at this crisis arose from her extreme readiness to get rid of her tyrant, who expected that his wives should love him passionately, all the time he was tormenting and persecuting them. His agents proceeded to write, after she had dined, she made a further declaration that she neither would, nor justly might, hereafter, repute herself as his grace's wife, or in any wise vary from what she had said and written, and again declared she had returned his majesty the ring delivered to her at her pretenced marriage, with her most humble commendations. The king was at this time at the Moor, in Hertfordshire. Another letter from Anne to her brother is preserved. It is without date, but evidently written at the same time as the preceding, and from the concluding sentence it is easy to perceive she dreaded the slightest interference from her continental friends would imperil her life. Brother, because I had rather ye know the truth by mine advertisement, than for want thereof be deceived by false reports, I write these present letters to you, by which ye shall understand that being advertised, how the nobles and commons of this realm desired the king's highness here to commit the examination of the matter of marriage between me and his majesty to the determination of the clergy, I did the more willingly consent thereto, and since the determination made, have also allowed, approved, and agreed unto the same, wherein I have more respect, as becometh me, to truth and good pleasure than any worldly affection that might move me to the contrary. I account God pleased with what is done, and know myself to have suffered no wrong or injury, my person being preserved in the integrity which I brought into this realm, and I truly discharged from all bond of consent. I find the king's highness, whom I cannot justly have as my husband, to be nevertheless a most kind, loving, and friendly father and brother, and to use me as honourably, and with as much liberality as you, I myself, or any of our kin and allies could wish, wherein I am, for mine own part, so well content and satisfied that I much desire my mother, you, and other mine allies, so to understand, accept, and take it, and so to use yourself towards this noble and virtuous prince, as he may have cause to continue his friendship towards you, which on his behalf shall nothing be impaired or altered in this matter, for so it hath pleased his highness to signify to me, that like as he will show to me always a most fatherly and brotherly kindness, and has so provided for me, so will he remain with you and other, according to the knot of amity which between you hath been concluded, this matter notwithstanding, in such wise as neither I, ne you, nor any of our friends shall have just cause of miscontent. Thus much I have thought necessary to write to you, lest, for want of true knowledge, ye might take this matter otherwise than ye ought, and in other sort care for me than ye have cause. Only I require this of you, that ye so conduct yourself as for your untowardness in this matter I fare not the worse, whereunto I trust you will have regard. Thus we see that Anne was in effect detained by Henry as a hostage, for the conduct of her brother and his allies, for she plainly intimates that any hostility from them will be visited on her head. Marillac, in relating this transaction to the king his master, in a letter dated July 21st, says, "The marriage has been dissolved, and the queen appears to make no objection. The only answer her brother's ambassador can get from her is, that she wishes in all things to please the king her lord, bearing testimony of his good treatment of her, and desiring to remain in this country. This being reported to the king makes him show her the greater respect. He gives her the palace of Richmond and other places for life, with 12,000 crowns for her revenue, but has forbidden the vicars and ministers to call her queen any more, but only my lady Anne of Cleves, which is cause of great regret to the people, whose love she had gained, and who esteemed her as one of the most sweet, gracious, and humane queens they have had, and they greatly desired her to continue with them as their queen. Now it is said that the king is going to marry a young lady of extraordinary beauty, a daughter of a deceased brother of the Duke of Norfolk. It is even reported that this marriage has already taken place, only it is kept secret. I cannot say if it is true. The queen takes it all in good part." This certainly was her best policy, as his excellency seems to think. July 28th, Cromwell was brought to the block, and 2 days after Dr. Barnes was committed to the flames at Smithfield. The divorced queen had reason to congratulate herself that she had escaped with life, when she saw what was the doom of the two principal agents in her late marriage. There are in Rymer's Foedera 2 patents subsequent to the divorce, which relate to this lady. The former, dated 9th January, 1541, is a grant of naturalization in the usual form. In the other, she is described as Anna of Cleves, etc., who had come into England on a treaty of marriage, which, although celebrated in the face of the church, yet never received a real consummation, because the conditions were not fulfilled in due time; that the marriage was, therefore, dissolved by mutual consent, and she being content to abide in this realm, and to yield to its laws, and to discharge her conscience of that pretended marriage, the king, of his especial favour, granted to her certain manors and estates in divers counties, lately forfeited by the attainder of the earl of Essex and sir Nicholas Carew, to be held, without rendering account, from the lady day foregoing the said grant, which was dated on the 20th of January, 1541. These estates were granted to her, on condition that she should not pass beyond the sea during her life. Anne of Cleves possessed the manor of Denham Hall, Essex, as part of her jointure or appanage, as appears from the court roll, beginning Cur Serenissime Doma Anne de Cleve. It may be observed the Stuart, not venturing to style her queen after the divorce, and not knowing what to call her, properly leaves a blank before Anne. During the 6 months that Anne of Cleves was Henry's queen, some very important changes were effected, especially the dissolution of the monasteries, and the institution of the 6 bloody articles. As far as her little power went, she was at this time a friend to the Reformation, yet soon after a convert to Catholicism. Owen Oglethorpe owed his promotion as a bishop to her favour. End of section 18.